Hello everyone, I'm Scott Payton, Manager of Marketing, Media, and Communications for Exemplar Global. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on assessing the risk-taking nature of auditors with Dr. Geoff Trickey. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Exemplar Global. We provide personnel certification for auditors and engineers, credential management for individuals seeking further professional recognition, and independent certification for training providers to enhance their course quality and outcomes. We build career pathways that support your career pathway. Our 25 years of building certification programs for our customers has provided us with the expertise to partner with you in the design, development, and delivery of a sustainable, recognized career for your profession. At Exemplar Global, we believe that the right people with the right skills deliver the right outcomes. Find out more about us at exemplarglobal.org. I'd also like to go over housekeeping items for today's session. The webinar will be muted to minimize ambient noise and distractions. However, we will have time at the end of today's session for a question and answer period. Please use the chat function to submit your questions, and you can submit your questions at any time during the session. After today's webinar concludes, you will receive an email with a link to the recording of the session, which you can view again as many times as you like. You will also receive a $10 credit toward a risk assessment. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Geoff Trickey. Geoff is a chartered psychologist with a bachelor's in psychology and a master's in educational psychology from University College London. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and an associate fellow of the British Psychological Society. Through roles as honorary research fellow at University College London, European manager for the Psychological Corporation, followed by a long association with Hogan Assessment Systems, Geoff has been privileged to work with an exceptionally influential pool of talent and laid the basis for an informed global perspective on psychological practices. Geoff set up PCL in 1992 and has overseen its continuous growth to establish its current global presence. He now devotes much of his time to research-based consultancy and innovative product development. Geoff, take it away.
Hello, Geoff Trickey then. I'm Managing Director at PCL. That's a company I founded a number of years ago. We're actually in our 24th year now. So we are organizational psychologists and very research oriented, very practitioner oriented. So I guess our mission in life is to find useful applications for psychology. In whatever spheres, but in particular within the occupational sphere. And one of our specialisms has been personality assessment. It's something that we've developed over many years, working with some very significant figures in that sphere. Over the past 10 years, though, we've been particularly involved in risk and the relationship between risk and personality. And that really has taken over my life to a considerable extent. So I spent a lot of time talking about it, researching it, writing about it, and so on. Just to pick up a point that Scott was making about asking questions, I hope that I'll be saying some things that you would want to question. I hope I'm not just repeating things you already know or views that you've already heard before. And I'm not going to be able to develop all of those points as we go through fully. So please make a note of those questions and let's deal with them at the end. Okay, my relationship with Exemplar Global goes back, I suppose, about 6 years in all. And Exemplar Global have showed a lot of interest in the research that we have been doing into risk type. And they sponsored the first major international profession-wide survey of practitioner propensity for risk in 2012. When I say practitioners, I mean auditors from working across the board. And as you know, it's a very varied profession. And the idea was to explore the implications of risk type for auditing professions and consider how that relates to ISO guidelines. And I have to say, ISO guidelines have moved gradually but definitely in our direction in terms of being interested in the human factor. Auditing, then, as I say, is a very broad, wide-ranging profession, and generalizing across all of those fields. It usually involves investigation, observation, interpretation of the observations and the data that you acquire, formulating ideas, drawing conclusions and making decisions and making recommendations. The point that we have to bear in mind throughout this presentation is all of those activities to some degree will require personal judgment. Personal judgment plays a significant part. Personality type is the real focus of our presentation, and this influences the judgments and the way that you make decisions. And so there's a fundamental relationship here with your professional practice, both in what you do within that and with what you're dealing with as an auditor in dealing with the work of other people. This is a quote here from Professor Sir Mark Walport. He is the UK government's chief scientific advisor, and he produced a report back in 2014, a couple of years ago, and he entitled his annual report, Innovation, Managing Risk and Not Avoiding It. Just a couple of points I wanted to pick up from there to reinforce what I was just saying about the subjectivity of decision making. Decision making draws, he says, on two brain systems. One of them is concerned with analytic view of the situation. So if you're making a decision, you analyze the pros, the cons, and so on. But the second system plays an important part, and this is an emotional system in the brain. Now that when it comes to risk taking and risk behavior, both of those play a part, as I hope to be able to illustrate to you. The other generalization is we often make our decisions instinctively. So very often we make decisions and rationalize them after the event. If you ask us after the event, we probably got a jolly good reason why we did it. At the time, we were perhaps working more on instinct than anything else. Now, I think there's a general issue, and it comes up in various spheres, about how we see systems in things. We expect things to be systematic. We expect to be able to unravel things and find explanations and solutions and so on. And within the risk sphere, this is particularly a significant issue. And I've titled this plate, as you can see, this slide, Illusions of Objectivity. The point here is that all estimations of risk are about probability. And they're not even usually based on true probability. True probability only arises when you know all the possible outcomes. So you get true probabilities in games of chance, throwing the dice, playing a roulette wheel, that sort of thing. So we don't actually we're not actually dealing with true probabilities when we're talking about risk. We're talking about estimations of probabilities. And generally speaking, we're basing that on historical data. And of course, we live in a dynamic world and a changing world where the technology is changing, the financial situation is changing, business is changing, and historic data has limited relevance. The other point is that we don't have a single metric for risk. There is no single way, no single unit of risk as there is for weight or for height or for distance and so on. So we measure things fairly arbitrarily. I say ad hoc here, but it has to adapt to whatever the data is and whatever the issue is, whatever the circumstances are. So we might, in terms of flights, we might be interested in how many accidents there are, but there may be how many accidents per 1,000 people. There might be how many accidents per year. It might be how many accidents in a typical lifetime. And when you're dealing with risk, always with very different populations. Those probabilities might be based on a population of passengers or drivers or workers or patients. So these are kind of ways in which the objectivity of what we're doing is eroded. Of course, we have people in the industry who are underwriters, for example, and actuaries who have very sophisticated ways of developing algorithms to help us to make the right decisions and to not take greater chances than we expect to. But none of those things are absolute. All of them rely on judgment. We're doing work at the moment with actuaries both in Canada and in the UK and in the insurance industry. And I can assure you, if you are already actuary, you know this. If you're not, well, this is the case. So you can work on making those predictions as objective as possible. But at the end of the day, there will always be a significant amount of judgment in all of those designs and all of those judgments. I mean, just invite you to look at these two pictures here at this point. I mean, I'm making a point here about what is actually a risk and how do we evaluate risk? How can we judge how risky a situation is? How can we put numbers on it? And in the first picture here, it illustrates, I guess, a major concern about health and safety. And health and safety is an example of us focusing on the risk out there. We tend in health and safety situations to say, well, that's a risky situation. That risk has to be dealt with, has to be addressed, has to be regulated and so on. So we tend to look at the risk out there. And in that particular example, the individual at the top of the ladder was actually fined in the UK under health and safety regulations, something to the tune of £30,000 because he was violating health and safety regulations. I mean, incidentally, the chap walking by, is it a chap? Is it a female? I'm not sure. Somebody's wandering past there with their mobile phone. I'm not sure if they're creating any risks, but they're taking risks, certainly. And that the person on that ladder, we don't know how many times he's done that before. Maybe something he's done every day since he was 14, and he may be 52. I don't know. So there are lots of factors about that situation that's very hard to judge without actually considering the person. Certainly it looks risky. He's bumped the van up onto the pavement. He's got a ladder there. Health and safety requires you have someone on the bottom of the ladder, so he got that right. But the other questions are, how sensible is that person? How experienced? How often has he done it before? Now, in the second picture, it's a similar situation, if you like. It's somebody doing something potentially dangerous in a public place. But this is apparently all right. These people didn't get fined, they got paid. And if you look at what they're doing, one of them is on a 10-foot motorcycle and the other also on a motorcycle, and they're juggling flaming torches and they're throwing them to each other. And if you look at there, they actually have an audience around them. And not only have an audience, but the children have been sat at the front so they can get a jolly good view of what's going on. So in one of these situations then, £30,000 fine. Another one, go home with the pack, whatever the collection happens to be on that day. Now, it's quite understandable that we focus on the risk out there, and I suppose that's the first picture exemplifies that. We fear what's going to happen to us in certain circumstances and so on, and that's really the trigger for being interested in risk, I suppose, at all. But the reality is that just looking at observing risk in that sort of way without taking the personal or the human factor into account is very dubious. I wouldn't like to say which of those two examples are taking the most risk. You might have your ideas and your judgments about it. But on the face of it, seems to me, depends entirely how long they've been practicing motorcycling. Did they learn it last Friday? Or have they been practicing it for the last, did they learn it in the circus as a child, in a circus family? We don't know that. But it's important, and it would be an important factor in trying to determine who's taking what risk. I mean, I'm laboring this point because the point I'm making is that the human factor is a very significant part of any risk situation. And this is something that the health and safety executive have recently increasingly tuned into, as have ISO, have also the British Standards Institute and the other risk bodies and professional bodies, and also the professions. And increasingly, you'll find articles that take this same line. So the human factor then, how important is it? This is the top is a quote here by Michael Mazar from the Rand Corporation. And his quote statement is, risk failures are mostly attributable to human factors. And he quotes then in his article, this is an article on the RIMS website that you can go and discover it for yourself. But the negative factors about human factors are when they're overconfident, their personalities get in the way, the group dynamics can be conducive to greater risk rather than less. The organizational culture can encourage risk, and discounting the outcomes and ignoring the results of what happened last time, obviously a negative influence. On the other hand, there are positive attributes that actually assist in the management of risk. So people who are being careful, who keep themselves informed, who are self-aware, they're not so overconfident, aren't open to criticism. In fact, they may be self-critical. And they're rigorous, open to new information and alternative perspectives. So what's interesting to me about those two groups of adjectives or descriptors is that they are all to do with personality. They are actually personality characteristics. So we're talking now, or Michael is talking the language of personality. So I want to go into that now briefly, just going away from the immediate field of risk and look at personality briefly. Some important points about personality. First thing is we know a lot about it. Personality assessment these days is extremely effective. It's very clearly defined. We know exactly what we're assessing and what the structure of it is and why we're assessing it and how we go about it. We measure it very reliably. Personality measures these days also are very, what should we say, the approach is generally approved by a wide body of people. So there's a lot of consensus about how you go about measuring personality. Fundamentally, it's about human nature. It's about what is the nature of human nature, as Bob Hogan would say. And it's something that's relevant to everybody. And it's a domain, if you look at the personality domain, it's a domain which is riddled with themes which are quite specifically about risk. So risk and personality then have got a very tight relationship together. And the interesting thing over the last 10 years is trying to tease out that relationship and see what we can learn from it and how that can be applied in a practical way. These are some of the themes within personality. On the left then, you've got a brief list there of personality characteristics that tend to make people more risk-taking. So being fearless, being impulsive, being complacent, being curious, curiosity killed the cat, as they say, being reckless, being too easygoing and casual. All of those things may have implications for how much risk you take or how much attention you pay to the risks that are going on around you, or how much attention you pay to the detail that you need to pay attention if you're going to make the world a safer place. And that's only a very tiny sample of all of the vocabulary that we have that is really about taking more or less risk. On the right-hand side, you've got the less risk characteristics, people who are vigilant, people who are innately anxious, and who are alert to any danger, people who are inflexible because they want to do things the way it's always been done. They like to do it the reliable way, the way that's been well rehearsed and well practiced and approved of in the past. They do it by the book. People who are apprehensive, so again, they're cautious, which is the next term, so they're closely related. People who are systematic and organized, you run into risks if you don't keep a tight diary, if you don't make notes about what you're supposed to be doing, if you don't check out that you've done the things you set out to do. So people generally who are disciplined will take less risks than people who are not. So this is a very extensive vocabulary. The other things about risk personality is personality remains very stable over a working adult's life. And personality tends to stabilize at maturity, but the brain actually doesn't really mature until around 20. So from that point onwards, down to the point where you're approaching retirement and later on in life, or when that stability may begin to fall apart for some people. But over that period of time, the global evidence, and vast amount of evidence for this, the personality characteristics you have will be very stable over your working life. Now, personality has, although it isn't the only thing that influences behavior, of course it's not, but it has a persistent and a consistent influence. So what you do day to day will depend on all sorts of things. What you have for breakfast, what was on television this morning, how your journey was to work, what you were doing last night, and so on. But at the same time, your behavior will always have a persistent and consistent influence. I describe it as having biographical significance. You can see from a person's biography, the series of things that they've done over a lifetime portrays what they are intrinsically like by their nature. So we all have within personality particular strengths and limitations, and any personality characteristic has a strength side to it and a limitations. It's a bit like height. Height, being tall is great for basketball players. It's not very good for people who want to do gymnastics. If you're trying to do cartwheels across the gymnastic floor as they do in the Olympics, then you want a low center of gravity for that, and that's the advantage. So it's the same with any personality characteristics. Being very extrovert is an advantage, but being very introvert can also be an advantage, depending what it is you're doing, and they can also both be disadvantages in another context. So personality assessment then is looking at these individual differences and helping people in the first place to understand themselves, but also helping those who need to manage people and recruit people and run teams of people and projects and so on. So as I was saying, personality doesn't choreograph your behavior. The point is we are all sentient beings. We all have free will. But nevertheless, we all have our own behavioral bias. If you are somebody who's rather impulsive, you may rein that in much of the time. But if you are an impulsive person by nature, sooner or later it'll pop up and it'll do something that you might regret. So risk type, if you like, the risk type is where your risk disposition is anchored. This is the way we like to illustrate it. The boat is anchored, but we can see it moving around in the wind and under the influence of the waves and the tide coming in and out. So it goes up and down, or it bounces around depending what's going on up there. And it's only over a period of time that we can really establish where that boat is anchored. And now people's behavior is like that. When we assess personality, we don't expect them to absolutely behave in a particular way the whole time. We all have that amount of versatility. We all have our comfort zone, and we can all push the frontiers of our comfort zone. But basically, your personality is your personality, and it stays like that, and it's a persistent influence. Okay, now the risk type compass then. What is the risk type compass all about? Well, there are two critical personality dispositions. This is going back now to the Government Chief Advisor report in a way. There are people who are emotional. There are people who are very emotional, fearful, pessimistic, anxious, cautious, all of those kinds of things. And the other end of that same scale, people are so calm, so sure of the future, so optimistic, they behave in an entirely different way. So in a crisis, the calm person is behaving it doesn't seem to be even aware of what's going on, whereas the fearful person may be climbing the wall and going frantic. So that's a huge difference. Personalities are much more different than you actually realize until you begin to analyze them. So that's one dimension, and you are somewhere between the two. Somewhere in your nature, you are either at the fearful, more fearful, pessimistic end, or at the optimistic, calm end of that continuum. We all are placed somewhere along that line. And secondly, we kind of also differ in the extent to which we are planned, organized, systematic, do things logically, analyze situations carefully, and to what extent we are more spontaneous, impulsive, and actually enjoy the excitement of the uncertainty. So you also fall somewhere on that continuum as well. You're somewhere between those two, as am I. So that gives us these two basic scales that we developed as a result of the research that we were doing. So you have an emotional scale, if you like, and an analytic scale, to use the Government Chief Advisor's language. And at the end of each of those is one of the risk types. So let me explain that to you. The intense risk type then is someone who's very cautious, very anxious, rather fearful, and very aware, got very sensitive risk antennae. They see the risk all the time. So they might be described as our guardians, if you like. It's like the geese in Rome that tell you that the invasion is coming. Those are the people who are going to alert you to it before maybe others. The composed type won't see it coming because they'll hang on in there until the last minute because they're not intensely in any way influenced by the risk that's going on around them until it's quite significant. In fact, they possibly will view what the other person views as a risk, they'll see as an opportunity. And so they'll want to hang on in there to the last minute to see what good can come out of the situation. So that's those two risk types, the intense and the composed. The prudent risk type are the ones that are very organized and systematic. And the carefree are the people who are more spontaneous, don't worry about things like not to know what's happening tomorrow, are more inquiring, more inquisitive, more innovative, like enjoy change and so on. So those are the main 4 risk types. But because you can be both intense and prudent, or you can be both prudent and composed, or you can have any of those combinations, there's a need to have another set of risk types which sit between the others for people who are both those other neighboring risk types. And what that gives us is a 360-degree spectrum where we can place people in terms of their risk dispositions. So the wary type then, at the top of your screen, those people have got 2 reasons to be risk averse. They're risk averse because they're anxious, they've got high sensitive risk antennae, and they're also very cautious, they're prudent. They want to do things in an organized way, in a systematic way. They don't like uncertainty. So they're fearful and they dislike uncertainty, if you like. So we call them wary, and wary people like to have everything under control. They're driven by their anxiety, but what they do is driven by their prudence. So they want everything under control and they want to know exactly what they're going into. At the bottom of the screen are the people who are the most risk-taking, and that's because they have a disposition which is very insensitive to risk, in the sense that they see opportunity in risk, if you like, and they're very calm and they're imperturbable, we would say. It's hard to get them excited. And on the other hand, they are also carefree, which means they are also by nature curious, spontaneous, and impulsive. So if you put those 2 things together, you've got carefree, impulsive people who don't have any antennae for risk and are calm even when there's a dreadful crisis. And of course, at the extreme, there are very few who are that extreme, but the extreme cases are quite extraordinary, and we can name a number of them, and I'm sure you will be able to too. The prudent, composed people who are both those on your right, the deliberate risk type, are people who are careful, organized, and systematic, but they're also very calm and unemotional. You'd be interested just to illustrate that one, because of a great illustration. We've recently been doing some work with air traffic controllers, and out of 96 or so air traffic controllers, I think 84 or so were deliberate risk type. And I think you're like me, you're probably very glad that the air traffic controllers are both prudent and composed. But that is the fact. Nearly all of them were either deliberate or prudent, or in that side of the risk type compass. Their opposite number, the excitable type, are in conflict, really, because they are spontaneous and curious and creative, but they're also intense. So kind of an artistic kind of person, really, or someone who works in drama, people who are attracted by fearful situations, but excited by them as well. We sometimes describe that as being like a moth to a flame, but it's not quite like that. But the excitable person has that combination. And that basically are the 8 risk types. And the assessment allows us to say whether you are a strong or weak example. This is the graphic that we use. That individual has been placed in the deliberate sector, but they're not an extreme example. If they were extreme, they would be near the outer perimeter. If they were in the axis, there'd be such a weak version of it, it wouldn't warrant a title, really. So we call that the axis group. And about 10% of people will fall there. And they have their own advantages and disadvantages. But you can see how the system operates. We have a risk typology, but those risk types act as numbers around a clock face. They tell you where you are within that 360-degree space. So it's continuously calibrated, if you like, around the edge. Now, this is, I think, a very interesting finding. We find now, this is a sample of something like 7,000 people. And what we find is there's a very even distribution of risk types, which is in itself very interesting. It causes us to use a term, team Homo sapiens. What it seems is that over evolutionary time, maybe, we have developed as a species to have this variation in our attitudes to risk. Not all species do that, do they? Rabbits, for example, are programmed to be timid, and lions are pre-programmed to swagger around the jungle feeling unafraid about anything. But human beings have this interesting capacity to have a variety of dispositions towards risk. And it seems to be maybe what's got us through. You can see how that might work. You know, in more primitive times, having people who are very alert to risk and fearful and protective and the guardians of the group are as valuable as those and as essential as those who want to go out there and fight for their survival and to go hunting and so on. So that's just the way it is. I mean, the implication of that for us in this century is that when you go out and about, when you're out there in the world on the train or meeting people in general, they're just as likely to be one of any of those 8 risk types. So it's quite an interesting and distinctive thing about people. Now, come to auditors. This is how they group. This goes back now a few years, but this was the data we collected in that original survey, which covered Australia and the UK and the United States. And overall, as you can find, just like the air traffic controllers, the majority of auditors tend to fall within the deliberate risk type. And the rarest are the carefree. Now, I don't know enough about all of the various versions of the auditing role, but you may be able to think of somewhere having a carefree auditor is actually a positive thing. It probably is. It's not, you know, in our view, it's not only what your risk type is, it's whether you're aware of that. It's important, whatever your risk type is, that if you have some self-awareness, then you can take that into account. And it's probably quite useful with any group to have people of a different risk disposition. It's almost a worry if everyone's exactly the same risk disposition. You know, if you're just a clone of one another, then you haven't got a lot of difference in the perspectives around you. And often it's very useful to have that variety in perspectives. So what are the implications then for auditors of those findings? The first point is, which risk type are you? And that has fundamental implications of its own. What is your own disposition towards risk? So if you're an auditor and you're making decisions about risk, or even if you're an underwriter, or even if you're an actuary, then your risk disposition is going to impact on your decisions. It may be mild, you may have it under control, you may have very professional practices that, and if you stay disciplined to those, then you may get through. But the point is, if you are one of the more risk-taking types, then your discipline is going to be more vulnerable than someone who is by nature more risk-averse. So knowing then what your risk type is the first thing, but then knowing what are the strengths related to that. You know, how is that going to benefit you in your professional life? And how can you maximize those strengths in your professional life? How can you turn that into good professional practice? But on the other hand, as I've said over the height analogy earlier on, every strength has got its reverse side, if you like, and every risk type has got its downside as well. So every risk type has its blind spots. Understanding people of the completely opposite risk type to yourself is quite a challenge, you will find. So how then, if you have blind spots, how do you manage them? First of all, obviously, you need to be aware of them, but how can you manage them? How can you compensate for them? Or how can you have alliances with others within your team and you mutually recognize whose antenna is where so that you can exchange views from both of those perspectives? How will your risk type impact on others, both your colleagues, but also in your role when you're dealing with people within an organization, for example, in a finance or research and development section? They're going to be very different in their risk type than people who are working in the financial part of the organization. And the salespeople, for example, they're going to be different again. So how does your risk type impact on others that you're having to deal with and negotiate with in your professional work? And how does risk type influence you then as an auditor? So that's the implications for you. The risk type of others is, as I've suggested, it's important because those are the people you deal with, and understanding that difference enables you to engage with them in a more effective way. It's relevant to how easily you engage with people and how much cooperation you easily get from them. I think if you're auditing, you'll probably have the experience if you're working with the sales team, trying to get them to complete things is much more difficult than it is if you're talking to the finance team, if you like, because they like doing things in off-the-cuff sort of ways, spontaneous sort of ways. And if you look at any team within an organization, what are the constitutional dynamics of that team in terms of their risk type? How does that work out? How much does the biases within the individuals, within the team, influence the bias overall? What we know is if you have a team that is too unvariable, is too, what's the word? If everybody's the same within the team, then you tend to even exaggerate even further those characteristics. So a highly risk-taking team, we talk about this as risky shift. A very risk-taking team will crank it up. They'll try to compete with each other to be even more the kind of things that they all admire. And the same with the risk-averse. So then risk culture, how does that work? And we would say it's the prevalence of the risk types within an organization, or particularly at the top of the organization, is very significant in the decisions that organization, the decisions it makes. And there's been some very, very interesting research on that recently from the banking sector in a paper referred to, I think it's headed The Wolves of Wall Street, in fact. But it's something that monitored senior management in banks over the period of the financial crisis and looked at what was having the biggest influence on the decisions they were making. So the other value as an auditor is that often you're dealing with teams in an organization. Risk type compass enables you to profile a team. So organizations are made of team, and from the board to a project team to the shop floor, at all of those levels, risk type compass is used. At the board level in particular, it's extremely valuable for people to understand why you're not seeing eye to eye within that dynamic group. If you discover it's actually because somebody's another different risk type, then you stop taking it personally that they're disagreeing with you all the time. Of course they will. They have a different perspective on the world. And once you appreciate and value that and develop some mutual respect, then that becomes an asset. Whereas if you don't know what you're dealing with, you're going into board meetings blind and there are resentments growing up between different participants, that's obviously destructive. And the success of any organization depends on team performance. The job of an organization is to develop high-performing teams, we would say. So team risk dynamics influence the decisions they make. And the RTC team report is an auditing tool. So something, again then, so you can, this is an aspect of your professional skill that you can develop. And in my view, this is the way things are going within risk management. There's an increasing emphasis on the human factor. And to be able to broaden your scope and your toolkit to enable you to make a contribution at that level is interesting, and it's also very exciting. We've done a lot of work with teams and using the risk type compass, and it highlights important functional and dysfunctional issues, and is very valuable for review and development. So this is a typical graphic for a team, and you can see here you've got a group of people who form virtually two factions. This is an actual team. So you've got one group of people who are more like, if you like, our air traffic controllers and more prudent and organized and systematic. But you've got a group who are both at the bottom there, the adventurous. They share the characteristics of being carefree and composed, remember. And there's another one out there, an outlier on his own or her own, being carefree. So I think you can begin to imagine what that does within that group. What happens is that the people who have a similar outlook tend to be together, to confer together, to talk together. And that can be quite destructive because you've got competition between two groups of people. If you understand that, then it's an advantage because in terms of risk management, you get a more balanced view of what's going on in your auditing work. Now, the point is, within any organization, you can draw the organizational diagram a bit like this very simple one on the screen. And you can say, well, this is going to be the accountants, this is going to where the order parts are going to be ordered, this is the delivery date where that's organized and so on. The critical thing is who is in the box and what is their risk type. If you've got somebody who's ordering the parts in little green box 2 in the middle there, now if they're a very spontaneous type of person, I'm afraid you're going to find they're not attentive to detail. People who are the carefree risk type, they have to make an effort to be attentive to detail. And on a day when they've had a a night out the night before, or they're tired or exhausted or not feeling too good, their ability to get down those order numbers may be somewhat impaired. Whereas if you've got somebody in there who is a much more cautious, risk type, then they will do a different kind of a job. So, and also go to the customer. What's the customer like? What kind of person have you got as a customer, and how would you deal with them? Because they'll be one of the 8 risk types too. So I hope you can see that you can draw a diagram, looks perfectly workable, it's very systematic, it looks very doable, but who you put in those boxes will make all the difference in the world. So this is international standards and the expectations about evaluating and controlling the risk associated with an audit program. There's a role there for risk type, both in terms of the things we've said about you as a professional auditor, understanding your own disposition in relation to the way you evaluate risk, and also understanding the variations or the influence of risk type within that organization and within the people you're dealing with in that organization. And also applying risk management principles, methods, and techniques relevant to your own discipline. Well, the skills of auditors tend to have been more to do with systems, processes, the way things are organized, and so on. And that is going to change. It's going to change because there's an increasing understanding that the human factor is a very significant part of the scene. I mean, if I take you back to the comment earlier on, which was that definitely the statement that was made by, well, in the RIMS article I was referring to, I hope I can find it. Risk failures are mostly attributable to human factors. So if that's the way the world is going, then it's going to be very useful for auditors to have something in their toolkit that helps them to begin to get to grips with that aspect of the situation. Now, I'm going to go very quickly now through a typical report. This is the sort of output that you would get, and you have an opportunity to complete this if that's what you would like to do. But this is the outcome. So the first page just gives you a very brief overview of the different risk types and a one-liner to orientate you to them so you can see how we would define them. The ones at the top there of the list are the least risk-taking, and the ones at the bottom the most. So it starts at the top with the wary risk type, if you remember, and at the bottom with the adventurous risk type. And there's brief descriptions. So that's to orientate you. This would be your page. This is the page that tells you, first of all, how strongly you reflect your risk type, and that's indicated on the graphic by how close you are to the edge. This person is adventurous, but it's a moderate amount of adventurousness. And then you get a definition of the adventurous risk type. Now, that definition is deliberately in extreme terms. We give you the caricature, if you like, the full works. This is what adventurous risk type implications may be. And of course, this person, those will have implications for them, but not to the same degree that it might do if they were nearer the edge. And we also give you an indication of what the opposite risk type is, because those are the things you are not. So it's quite interesting to come at it from both ways. And if you are close to a boundary, then you'll also get an indication of what the risk type across the boundary is like and what their characteristics are. You also get a brief statement about your risk perception, about your reaction to risk, about how much risk-taking you are comfortable with, and also about the impact of all that on your decision-making. Now, this is an interesting part. We talk about risk type. I mean, that's there are only 8 risk types, and people I think are unique, and you are unique. So the whole purpose of this report is to help you to draw your own conclusions from what we tell you. And some of that you'll be able to take on board very immediately, and some of it may be relevant. You may awaken something in your understanding about yourself, which is very useful. But it's up to you to draw from it whatever we can tell you. So we give you a list of bullet points here that are generally viewed as the positive sides of that risk type. And then the bottom of that page would be the aspects of that risk type which might be considered the downside or a disadvantage in some circumstances. Then you have at the top of the next page, prominent characteristics. You see, within the risk type compass, there's something like 20 different themes in the questions that we're asking you. And in some of those themes, if you're a very distinctive risk type, then you'll be answering in a very predictable way. As you go nearer the center, as you're less distinctively one risk type or another, then there's room for some contradiction in the way that you would have answered some themes. I'll give you a good example of this. We find with city traders working in the financial sector, that very often they are risk takers, but they have certain qualities which you would associate with people who are not risk takers. That is to say, they tend to be, although they're risk takers, they still tend to be quite mistrustful. Mistrustfulness is something that usually goes with people being more emotional and less risk taking. So it's a sort of counterintuitive, but that's how humans are. And that's why so few people, I guess, are successful as city traders. I think the fallout rate with people who are trained to become city traders, something like 90% and more. So as you can see, that having that quality of being both mistrustful but also being a risk taker is helpful, apparently, to city traders. Okay, so that's a sample of an auditor report. And this is just to remind you that if you would like to complete the questionnaire, and if you would want to do that and receive your own report, then email us at info@psychologicalconsultancy.com and we'll set that up for you. And if you get that and then you think, well, this is interesting, but I'd like to have a discussion with an organizational psychologist or somebody who knows this tool really well, and we offer you a 45-minute feedback session for $150, which is the 30% discount on what you would normally pay. But that's just if you're interested enough to want to take it further.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Geoff. This is Jackie Barber from PCL. We've had a number of questions come in, so I'd like to go through those. So first of all, would understanding risk type have implications for personal investors?
Yeah, well, that's what the regulating bodies would say, and I think yes, it does. And it has not only does it have implications for the investor, it has implications for the person who's selling the investment, and if they're joining a hedge fund, then it has implications for the hedge fund manager. The point is that obviously investments vary considerably in the amount of risk involved, and the better the payoff, the more risk you're prepared to take. So from every point of view, whether you're a risk taker or not, it's interesting to have that understanding that you are more likely than other people to say yes to this proposition. And are you sure that's what you want to do in a logical sort of way? You may be disposed to say yes, but you might need to think about it more carefully. In terms of financial advisors, when people complete our assessment in that context, I mean, financial advisors will get their investors to complete the risk type compass. And the report the advisor gets is one that says, well, this person is very attentive to details, so you just be prepared for questions. Or this person is perhaps not very attentive to details, so make sure you back everything up in writing. That sort of thing, because it's important to all parties. But as far as the regulators are concerned, they say that you should only sell financial products to people that are appropriate for their appetite for risk. So appetite for risk is their language for what we would call risk disposition or risk type. Okay. Does that cover it?
Yes, that's great. Thank you. So why do you think there are so few carefree auditors in your sample?
I think it's not unusual that even when you have a very a great deal of consistency within a profession, that there are people who are not. You have within, for example, a similar sort of profession might be accountancy. You have people in accountancy who are also quite carefree. And you can see a role for them in that sort of context because they're very good at winning business. They're very good at taking people out for dinner, being entertaining, being amusing. I mean, your typical tax-oriented accountant, it may not be the most sociable person. In my experience, if you go into a tax office, it's very quiet. People may just look at you over their glasses when you go in, but they don't climb over their desk to say hello. Whereas if you go into certain other situations, then you'd find that they would. So those kinds of distinctions, I forgot what I'm saying. I've got lost here. The distinctions, the characteristics are very consistent. Remind me again. Oh yeah, so the carefree type. So the carefree type will have a role in most situations. I mean, if you're an auditing organisations, then you still got to advertise your product. You still got to get out there. You still got to meet people, press the flesh, win new business. So within most organisations, there is a degree of function where that can work. The other point is that some people, some auditing roles will require you to have a better understanding. They will be high risk taking people. So for you to understand and work with them, for example, on an oil rig, you don't have people on an oil rig who are very cautious and careful and fearful, believe me. Certainly not working at the drill head. So if you're working or auditing in a dangerous situation, or take heavy industry and smelting aluminium, you don't get people working in that context who are very wary and risk averse. They're people who are prepared to handle molten metal on a day-to-day basis. So having somebody who has a more in tune with that could be a positive feature for some people. But here I'm suggesting here, but I know it happens, and I know that even within air traffic controllers, there weren't actually any completely carefree types, but there were some who were slightly more risk-taking than the majority.
Great. How can an auditor not audit risks based on their own type? Will this create a biased audit?
Well, I think the bias is in you as a person, and it's always there. It's going to be, you either will be the sort of person who embraces the idea of holidays that are with wet water rafting or whatever it's called, and climbing in the treetops in the Amazon, or you might be the person who would never accountancy. You know, it affects everything you do, from than how much you enjoy novel foods, how adventurous you are in your appetites, how you have your holidays. How you have your holidays is a great example, because people who are risk averse plan everything ahead. They count their passports several times. They check their flight details endlessly. They make sure they have got the address of the place they're going to in wherever it is they're going. They give plenty of time to get to the airport before the planes are due to take off, so on and so on. I mean, it affects all these little decisions. It even affects how you cross the road. If you are very risk averse, if your partner is risk averse and you're more risk taking, then you're going to get across the road and be looking back saying, "Oh, sorry, I thought we were going." So it is very nitty gritty in the sense of how it influences your day-to-day life. So as an auditor, you just need to understand that. I mean, auditing has many systems and they've been embraced, haven't they? Things like, I'm trying to think, Lean, for example, and Six Sigma, those kinds of techniques that you have. And there'll be many ways you have of evaluating risk and calculating risk and putting a figure on risk. And you have all those systems. The fact that you're carefree, if you are carefree, then you need to take that into account when you do them and make sure that you are in that mindset when you do turn your mind to them. Because everybody can do that. We're not automaton. Whatever we are, if we put our mind to it, we can do it. The problem comes in terms of vigilance and doing it on a routine and regular basis, on a continuous basis, because that you won't do. I mean, if you have someone who's carefree type in an atomic power station and their job is checking the dials every day, and every day of the year for the last 10 years, those dials haven't moved, then how the carefully they are now checking the dials would very much open to question, I would suspect. Whereas somebody who's very risk averse would be doing it absolutely rigorously all the way through. So it's that kind of a thing.
Okay, will individuals behave in a riskier manner in a professional capacity, a more riskier manner in a professional capacity than private, or vice versa?
I think we all have to manage our own behavior. Whatever our personality is, we manage it. People who are very introverted can be very effective in jobs that require them to socialize. The point is, at the end of the day, they'll be exhausted, and they may not always grasp the opportunities that they could have grasped because they've got a slight resistance to going out and meeting yet another person. So it's not that you can't do these things. It is a bias. But it's a persistent bias. So it's always something to be aware of. Being knowledgeable about yourself, as the Greeks used to say. That is wisdom. Understanding yourself is the most profound kind of wisdom. And so to the extent that you understand how that plays out, and you become an observer of yourself. I think when you get into this kind of self-awareness mode, you say, well, there I go again. You may be this sort of person who's rather adventurous, and so you sometimes might make inappropriate remarks because you speak before you think. And if you are that kind of a person, then, and you now know it, then you say, damn it, I did it again. And it might have been in a professional context, where you're trying to be disciplined and you're trying to be professional and you're trying to be serious about what's going on. But because you're rather impulsive and rather spontaneous and rather risk-taking, you might chance a remark which is quite inappropriate or not so inappropriate. So we all need to learn to manage the kind of people we are by our disposition, and we all largely do it. But except, if you're an extreme case, then it's obviously much harder for you to do that if you're an extreme case. What we look for within organizations is openness about this. And we do a lot of work in heavy industry, and I think the important thing is that the people have a mutual respect for the way people are. And that's a very positive thing, both in terms of health and safety or any other kind of risk management situation. Knowing, what the dynamics are and having mutual respect. That's what gets people on side. So when I've been mentioning things like ROSPA and the health and safety executive and so on, and their recognition of the risk factor that is the human risk factor, what they're advocating is that people are more open, that they get people more involved, so that people get into a situation where they're part of the policy, part of the process of reducing risk, rather than someone who's continuously being admonished for not doing things right, not doing it all the wrong way. So that, when you get people on side, it works really well. We work in people who work in very different and dangerous environments. If you get them working together in that sort of situation, having mutual respect for it, you get them on side in the first place. So you get rid of this them and us situation. If, on the other hand, you treat risk in a health and safety context now in a way where it's just all about discipline, then you will find that you won't have people on side. They may be very reluctantly doing it, but they'll be doing it reluctantly, and that's not good in terms of getting rid of that residual amount of risk liability that goes on. And we've worked in a number of companies that've got a very good risk record, but there's a residual amount of risk taking that they find very difficult to eliminate. And in our view, in order to eliminate that, you have to have people on side. You have to respect what people are, because for every individual, towing the line in terms of what's required in that job is a different agenda. And if you recognize that and help those people understand it so that they're managing themselves better in the situation, that, in my view, is how you take the whole, risk management agenda another step nearer to the ideal.
Okay. So does a person's risk type change with age or career position?
The thing that changes with career position is that you are in danger of becoming less concerned with the way you come across to other people. As when people join a big organization as a young graduate, say, then they behave themselves and they look around them and see how things should be done, and they toe the line and so on. But the time you are now the CEO, you think you're the big I am. I mean, that's the danger. People are no longer speaking truth to power. They may not be telling you when you're behaving in a very foolish manner because they're too anxious to agree with you and so on. So there's that sort of factor. As people get promoted and more serious, I mean, it's not everybody, obviously, but that is the danger. The danger is that in an advanced situation, you're not answerable to anybody else. Are you still being disciplined in the way that you behave? So that's within the work kind of a situation, how it would work out as you go. And what was the other example in that question?
Change with age or career position.
Oh, it's the age thing. Yes, there are changes with age, because personality gradually changes towards as you get towards retirement age. So there's a trajectory. It's a gradual one. It seems to affect both of the underlying scales of the risk type compass in a different way. So that people who were very adventurous become slightly more apprehensive as they go older. You can see that if you take the analogy of going out in the snow. When you're a young person, going out in the snow is very exciting and fun and thrill. But when the same individual is 65 and got a walking stick, it's a different scenario altogether. So yeah, there's things like that do change, particularly, but it's particularly at the very end. And also very young people, of course, but before they get up to the age of 20, then the risk taking, particularly among males, is really quite extreme in terms of the accident statistics for driving accidents and so on, as you probably know. So yeah, it settles down between 20 and say 60, but there is, obviously there's a lot of individual variation in that, but that is the general picture, and that holds up. It's very well sustained over global research.
Great, thank you, Geoff. And thanks to everyone for all of the questions. We're actually at time now, so if we haven't been able to answer yours, then we will come back to you personally. And as Scott mentioned, we'll circulate a copy of the slides and a recording of this webinar, and together with details of how to access the Risk Type Compass assessment, as well as if you want to book a feedback session with one of our psychologists. So thank you, Geoff, thanks, Scott, and thank you to everybody for listening today.